One of the worst Cobra effects in history took place here in the Soviet Union during the last half of the 20th century on a lake that used to be called the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea was the world's fourth largest lake. It was roughly the same size as Ireland and supported a thriving community of fishing towns and port cities. This is the same lake in the same place today. So what happened to all of it? Tracing satellite images back over the past few decades can start to unravel part of the mystery. These pictures show that the lake began drying up in the 1960s when it was last full. So what caused it all to start in the first place? The short answer is Stalin, but there's more behind the story than just that. During the Soviet Union's existence, the Aral Sea alone provided 1/6 of all the fish in the country and employed more than 40,000 people. But a few poor decisions ended up erasing this entire natural landmark and all of those jobs from the surface of the earth. You see, this guy named Stalin became the leader of the USSR, and he believed that his government could transform nature itself to benefit his people. There are two rivers that used to feed the Aral Sea, the Amu Darya in the south and the Sir Darya in the east. Stalin's plan was to have his engineers divert water from both of these rivers by digging canals towards new fields that would be planted across Uzbekistan that would begin growing cotton. The plan was to make cotton a major Soviet export at any cost, and little regard was given to what would happen to the Aral and the community surrounding it. And for a time, it kind of worked. By 1988, Uzbekistan became the world's largest producer of cotton, and the Soviets were exporting it across the world, but it was coming at a massive cost. Those canals that the Soviets began finishing in the 1960s were not only taking enormous amounts of water from the lake, but they were also insanely inefficient and leaked constantly. As a result, the fourth largest lake in the world began steadily drying up. By 1998, it had shrunk to just 60% of its original size, and by 2004, it was down to only 25% of its original size. But in addition to this, the other half of the disaster was the rapidly increasing levels of salt that the lake was getting. What remained of the lake in 2004 was 5 times saltier than it was back in the 1960s, which meant that basically the entire ecosystem and the creatures that once lived in and around it were gone. The largest coastal port town named Aralsk that was the center of the lake's fishing economy was now located over 100 kilometers away from the water and was surrounded by dried up, worthless land. As the lake receded further, it created a new gigantic desert instead, covered in salt that made it worthless for things like agriculture. But that's still not the end of the tragedy, because the lake was often used as a dumping ground for toxic chemicals and weapons for decades too. Now with the lake bed exposed, those chemicals and weapons were just sitting out in the open, and the winds have began kicking all of this up into huge toxic dust storms that ravage across the landscape. Life around the former Aral Sea today is a harsh one. Infant mortality is very high at 75 deaths per 1,000 births. If the Aral Sea region were its own country, that would be the 5th worst rate in the world, even worse than countries like Nigeria or Mali. The cotton boom that was once exploding in Uzbekistan has been challenged by the rampant dust storms that deposit salt and toxins across their fields. Even more water is being used from the Aral Sea rivers to wash away the salt, and the lake is just a fraction of what it once was, down to only 10% of its original size now. There are plans to revive the lake in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but so far the legacy of bad Soviet engineering policy still looms high over the lives of those who still live here and haven't fled from one of the worst Cobra effects in history.